Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's been a minute since I filmed, and the reason for that is because I got sick. I got corona. That was a whole other mess. I was out for a while, but to get back into the swing of things, I thought I'd film like a quick recommendations video. I'm sorry, by the way, if you hear a lot of like weird audio. I live in South Texas. I'm still lucky enough to have power, so we have just our heater, my heater unit thing, blasting warmth for us. But I just thought I'd mention that real quick. So yeah, I'm gonna film a quick recommendations video. This is by no means like a unique premise. Everyone recommends books on BookTube, but the way I want to do it is that I pick a topic. In this case, you can probably see based on the title that the topic that I'm going to talk about are books that I read while I was a university student that I actually enjoyed reading, because you know, when you get assigned to read something for class, it's like it's a drag to like read what you are being told to read as opposed to what you want to read. But I actually did enjoy these books. I have 5 books to talk about and then 2 honorable mentions that I'll kind of gloss over. The reason why I want to do these types of like quick random recommendation videos is because for the most part I only really do wrap-ups and like dedicated reviews to ARCs. I've recently been doing dedicated reviews to ARCs, so those are new releases. I don't really get to talk about books that I read a year or 2 or 3 years ago, so this is kind of just my way of doing videos to harken back to older books that I've read. And these are by no means like my favorite books of all time, but I do think that a lot of people would enjoy them if they got the chance to pick them up. I was a history student. I also minored in anthropology, so a lot of these are like humanities area. That's kind of where they fall under, so you won't really see a lot of like hard sciences here. It's not really my thing. Okay, so I think that's pretty much the preface for the video. I hope I'm not forgetting anything, but I'm just gonna jump into it. So the first book that I want to talk about is Queen Victoria, Gender and Empire by Susan Kingsley Kent. So I read this for a 19th century history class. This is one of these short biographies from the World in a Life series that Oxford Press put out. I think there's only like 6. I think they should definitely do more because I really enjoyed this particular one. I know they have one on like Margaret Thatcher and conservatism or whatever. I know they also had one on Simone de Beauvoir, a few other people, but I really enjoyed this one. This is a biography, but it's by no means like one of those like giant chunky like tome about like a US president or whatever. This is barely let's see how long this is. This is barely 200 pages, including like references and stuff. This is biography, but it more so uses Queen Victoria as like a focal point or a lens in which to view England and England's greater empire at the time. And obviously this particular book focuses on gender and empire. Both are very interesting topics. I personally, when I had to do an assignment on this book, I wrote like a 7-page paper that I had to like write to prove that I read the book. I focused on gender, and as you can see, I have tons of tabs on this. I don't know if you can see, there's like tons of tabs. The historian who wrote this wanted to answer a specific question. That question was, how does a country, an empire like England that has such rigid rules in regards to gender, men are the ones allowed to go out and get a job and to vote, and women are not? How does this country maintain that idea while having a woman the most powerful person in the empire? Like, what are the mental hoops that people jump through, or how did Queen Victoria and her people allow this to happen? That's the part that I focused on when I read this, but the empire parts are very important. They talk about England's massive empire. I want to say they focus, or the author focused more so on Africa and India. I don't think that the author, I mean, this is barely 200 pages, so she couldn't just like rip into Queen Victoria, but I do think the author was pretty critical of her, because looking at Queen Victoria, when I read this, it was probably like 2018 when I read this, and looking at Queen Victoria through the lens of a person from 2018, she obviously did some very bad stuff. You don't run an empire by being like a good person. So it was very eye-opening in regards to things that she's done and things that England has done to perpetuate their neo-colonialist, imperialist agenda. I read it in one day, 1 because it was like really quick, and 2 because I procrastinated when I really shouldn't, because I really did enjoy this. So the next book that I want to talk about is The Maya by Michael D. Coe and Stephen Houston. So I read this for my Maya archaeology class. This is very much just like an introduction text to the Maya civilization that lived within like the Mesoamerican area. And this book basically talks about the rise of the Maya all the way up until like the eve of their people being colonized. But this book also talks about like the setting, the natural resources they use, their beliefs in regards to like religion and spirituality. I also want to say that I learned like their numerical system and their calendar system reading this book. But yeah, it's very much an introduction. If you're like interested in like this civilization, I'd recommend this one. Also, fun fact, when I read the arc for Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, she mentioned this book being like a huge inspiration for that fantasy novel. So I mean, if she got inspiration from this, maybe you might get just inspiration from this if you want to write like a Maya inspired book. I like this particular edition. It was probably kind of pricey because the papers are like kind of that glossy, but they have tons of pictures that are super helpful for learning. I'm a very visual person, and this book had like tons of maps. I still remember like their numerical system, how it worked, and like few symbols for sun. But yeah, this is a really great text that I think anyone can pick up. It's very digestible for being like a more standard version. Like, this is more so a textbook than the previous book, but I think it's very easy to get through. I think it's also sectioned off pretty well, so it doesn't seem like this kind of cluttered mess of just tons of information. I'd assume that this book, based on what I've read about it, has been used in a lot of like Maya archaeology, history type classes, so it's probably pretty popular. I like don't know the exact numbers of like publication, but this is the 9th edition, so it's like it's been around for a hot minute. So the next book is also a more like standard, like this is like a textbook, but again, this one's super easy to read and easy to get through, and it's A Short History of Scientific Thought by John Henry. So I read this for a history class. I think it was called Development of Modern Science, something along those lines. And the reason why I wanted to take this class is because I do like learning about hard sciences when it's explained to me, but like if you put me in a physics class, like I will fail. Like I did fail my physics classes. I would get like 20s and 30s like on exams. Like it was pretty bad. But this is like a science book, but for people who want to look at science through like a historical lens. And it's pretty self-explanatory. The title kind of just says it all. This book starts off with like Plato and Aristotle, and then it goes all the way into like atomic theory. The chapters are incredibly small. I would say most chapters are between like 10 and 15 pages, so you can really knock them out pretty well. And it really does explain like a lot of these scientific theories and developments in a really easy way for most other people who aren't in like the field of science to like understand. There's two major themes that came up in this book a lot, and the first thing that was pretty prominent was how philosophers or scientists were able to reconcile their religious beliefs with the scientific development that they were a part of. Most of the people that are talked about here are Christians, but there are some chapters where we talk about obviously like classic civilizations, or this book does also talk about the Islamic contributions to science while England was going through its like dark ages. The Islamic world was like flourishing with sciences and all that kind of stuff. But for the most part, a lot of the people that are talked about here are Christian, and they are men, so that's kind of like a downfall of this book. That's a valid critique of this book, how most of the people that are talked about here are white Christian men. But how did these men kind of make room for God in their scientific developments? And the other thing that was talked about a lot here, according to the author, was that while we do have some pretty prominent figures like Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, they are very important in the world of science, that they are not these figures that kind of just came upon a theory. They've been built up by people before them. He's basically saying how there's no like singular genius in the world of science. Everyone's building upon each other, if that makes sense. So the next book that I'm going to talk about was from an LGBT history class. I was actually part of the class, like the guinea pig class, because my professor introduced it into the like curriculum, and the department wanted to see like a trial run to see how well the class would do. I was part of like the guinea pig class. I was like one of the first people to take this class, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it like great remarks, and hopefully the university will keep teaching this class. But yeah, it was the LGBT history class, and the book is Charity and Sylvia, A Same-Sex Marriage in Early America by Rachel Hope Cleaves. I really enjoyed this book. Obviously, it's on the list. This book is basically about two white Christian women, and I say that because I think it's important to know that this relationship probably would not have happened the same way if one or both of them were women of color. But it is basically about these two women in early America having a life together, despite the fact that women had very, very little rights given to them at the time. These women met in 1807 and had a really long life together. They basically were like domestic partners, I guess. I want to say they lived together for like 30 or 40 years, or they knew each other for 30 or 40 years. Everyone in the town that they lived in knew that they lived together. They knew that there was no like man in that house. I want to say the older woman of the relationship, I want to say it was Charity. Her name was like on the documentation. When they filled out like a census type form, Charity put her name in like the place where the man puts the name. Sylvia's nieces and nephews referred to Charity as like their aunt. So I don't want to say that everyone in town was like super open and they like loved lesbians or anything, but it was kind of like an open secret. It was kind of treated in like the modern like gal pals thing, where I want to say a few years ago, I don't know if you remember, if you follow social media, but allegedly the actress Kristen Stewart was like seeing another woman, but tabloids couldn't call her like a lesbian and couldn't call her girlfriend because they didn't want to get like sued or whatever. So they called Kristen Stewart's alleged girlfriend gal pal. And everyone's like, oh, they're just gal pals, they're just friends. That's kind of like the way that people looked at Charity and Sylvia. But they were also like really well loved by their church. They were members of their community. I want to say they were both seamstresses, and they would take on like a young girl apprentice every now and then. But I think Charity was also pretty skilled in like tailoring clothes for men as well. Like these women were pretty independent given the time, and their relationship and their situation was really unique. That's why I really enjoyed reading this. I hit my camera, so I'm not sure if like the angle changed a little bit. I'm sorry about that. The historian not only documented the relationship well, she also threw in some poetry analysis, because a lot of times women would write really sweet poetry to each other, and most people saw it as like a friendly thing. Because if I remember correctly, women weren't seen as like sexual beings. Women only wanted to have children, and women didn't have like sexual gratification. Or at least it was believed that women didn't enjoy sex the way men would enjoy sex. So the poetry that women would write to each other was very romantic and very sweet, but it was never seen as sexual, even though the author argues that if you read some of this poetry, it's very clear that some of these women were writing about sex to other women, and I really enjoyed those parts as well. If I remember the introduction correctly, I want to say that the historian like happened to find a bunch of these letters that Charity and Sylvia had written to each other and to other people. So this wasn't something that the author was like hunting for. She kind of just came across this instance of a same-sex relationship, and out came this book. As we all know, same-sex relationships have been around forever. Maybe not necessarily like the labels that we give each other nowadays, but I think this was an interesting book to see at least the dynamics of at least this one relationship in a time where people were a little more puritanical. Women were seen as property. Before I talk about the last book, and probably my favorite book on this list, I want to give some honorable mentions. I'm not going to go into detail, and the reason for that is that these are popular books, and I kind of want to mention them because I did enjoy them, so they do technically fall under this list. The first book being The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Super popular book. I read this for feminists in literature. It was like an English class. I needed to take a writing intensive class, and that class called Out to Me. Yeah, everyone knows what this book is about. I first read it for this specific class, so I didn't, like, I understood that there was hype, didn't understand the hype until I read this. I get it now. And the second honorable mention is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. This is the first book in a trilogy that follows Thomas Cromwell's rise to power, being Henry VIII's like right-hand man, I guess, until Cromwell was eventually executed. I don't think that's a spoiler, but this is kind of like a fictionalized rise to power. I read it for a Tudor Stuart history class. My professor thought that for being a fictionalized account, it is pretty loyal to like historical events. This book won the Man Booker Prize for 2009, so it got a lot of love. The last book that I'm going to talk about was also for my feminism in literature class, and that is Bloodchild by Octavia E. Butler. So this is a collection of short stories by the iconic Octavia E. Butler, who is a really prominent voice in the like sci-fi speculative fiction community. She was a very notable author, but this is a collection of her short stories. This is the second edition, so there's like more short stories here than previous edition. This is probably the best short story collection I've ever read. I don't remember ever disliking any of the stories here. There's always one short story in a collection that you dislike, but I don't remember disliking any of these. I do have favorites, Bloodchild being one of my favorites, and the other one was called Amnesty, I think. Amnesty was the other short story that I really liked, but all of them are really enjoyable. Butler tends to really play with themes of gender, identity, womanhood, other like intersectional topics. Her stories are really unique, and on top of that, she's just like a really great writer. If you have to read any of these, I would recommend this one. Again, it's also really short, and they're short stories, so you could probably read one like before bed and like get through it. They're really good. I will say that some of these stories do have violent imagery, sexual content. I want to say that there's also like mentions of like sexual abuse and like rape. Just letting you know, you should probably look into content warnings for this one. So that was my last book. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know if there are other topics or things that you want me to recommend. They can be really specific or not. I'd love to talk about books that I haven't got to talk about in a while. I was a student from 2014 to 2018, so it's been a hot minute since I've read these, but I do remember really enjoying them. Thank you again for watching. I will link all my socials down below. I'll also link some kind of more important like social issues, ways to help down below. You're always free to like send me links that you think need to be shared. I'd love to put them in the link box down below. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe, or do neither of it. It's all good with me, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.